So this is a small group, so I'm very informal in how we do these things. Interrupt me at any time. I don't need to wait and do questions at the very end. They asked me to base this talk on my TED Talk that was done in 2015-16. So I'm going through parts of the TED Talk aspect of it, hitting some of the high points there, but also then just interjectingly answering questions as we go along the way. The goal really is, how do we actually change the educational system? And most of you are looking at this from the homeschool environment perspective, which also means, how do you make sure that what you're going to use in your homeschool environment actually is going to be effective? And that's the same question we have with the schools. How do we know that what methodology we're using for literacy programs are actually going to be effective? Is it just because you heard someone say it worked for their kid, or you heard someone say some school bought it? And there's different levels of effectiveness. So these are all the companies that my colleagues and I have built over the years. I'll hit them really quickly, and that is University of Florida is where I'm a research assistant professor, and I'm an alumni, did my PhD at University of Florida. The Morris Center, Ponte Vedra Beach, all of the Morris Center clinics are transdisciplinary medical clinics, which means OT cross-trained with speech pathology, cross-trained with clinical psychology, neuropsychology, cross-trained with educators, and they do a very comprehensive model of assessment and or treatment services for a wide range of developmental difficulties. So that means all of the learning disorders, reading, spelling, writing, math, language disorders, autism, intellectual difficulties, any aspect that's affecting learning and learning deficiencies. That's what the medical clinics are designed for. There's one at Ponte Vedra Beach, one in Birmingham, Alabama, one in the country of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And no, I don't have a resort home there. People jokingly ask me, why did I put a clinic in Trinidad? It's a very simple answer. The professionals there demanded it. I'd had about 20 kids come from Trinidad to one of our other Morris Center clinics. And when you take a child, make anywhere from 4 to 8 grade levels of change in their reading skills in just 4 months, everybody in the country notices. It's only a country of 1.2 million people. The whole country runs on Facebook and WhatsApp. So word travels really fast. So after these 20 kids, it all kept coming back again and again and again. The local professionals said, we want our own Morris Center clinic. And that request was in April of 2016. I only half-heartedly, because I really didn't believe this was going to happen, said, well, if you find the Trinity speech pathologist, the Trinity trained and local OT, the Trinity trained and local clinical psychologist, and the Trinity trained and local school psychologist, I already have the teachers trained in that country, then we'll open a clinic. And they took me to heart seriously, and that conversation was in April of 16, and literally 5 months later, the clinic opened. So if you know anything about the Caribbean, nothing happens fast in the Caribbean. So to go from conversation to opening a clinic, that is just unheard of. That's how much the local professionals wanted their own clinic. They manage it, I own it, but we run it together. And so that one's been running for 6 years. The Neurodevelopment of Words Now company is an online ed tech company. Many families don't need the expert services of the medical team. They don't really need the speech therapist or the OT, but they need programs that have been either evidence-based, which means tested and proven to be highly effective, or at least research-based. There's a theoretical model as to why we're doing what we're doing, and there's extensive data theoretically saying this should be helpful, should be effective. So we built the ed tech company to push out those services globally, webcam to webcam with live instructors, interacting with your students. It's not the horrid thing that happened with COVID, which was kids were actually forced to sit online and watch someone do a lecture for like 6 hours a day, which was not effective instruction. It's not even effective live. But it's even worse when you have to sit in front of a computer screen. And in the Caribbean and some other parts of the world, kids literally had to sit in front of their computer from 8 to 12. They got a break for lunch, and then they're back in front of the computer from next 3 hours until 3 o'clock. And they're being directly just lectured at the whole time. And that doesn't provide very effective education. And as many of you might have experienced, it's not the way to do things. So we built an ed tech company that's interactive, it's highly trained staff. We never stop training the staff. One of the programs is evidence-based. The other 3 programs are research-based. And that today, we're pushing out services to over 500 students online every day. Good news is many of those kids are not even paying for the services, because we partner with school districts, and some families can use your Florida Empowerment Scholarship they were talking about, and that helps have families have access to other financial resources to get access to these programs. The Einstein School is the first in the United States charter school only for kids with dyslexia. By first in the United States, I mean we opened that school in 1999. I'm one of the founders of that school, and I'm the president of the board of that school, and I have been for 24 years. We set that school up to show the public school system it's not a monetary problem that holds you back from being more successful. You have enough money. Because a charter school typically only gets about 75% of the budget that a public school gets. And we actually, in Gainesville, Florida, just about an hour and a half north of here, we beat our county by double, triple, and quadruple the growth on reading skills every year for the last 24 years, and including the state average here in the state of Florida. Our goal was show the public system with a working model how you could do this. 2 years in opening that school in 2001, we got a $250,000 grant to produce, this is going to date us, a VHS videotape showing how the school works, how it runs, and funds to let us send it to schools all over the state of Florida. And we got zero interest of actually asking to duplicate what we've set up. So the goal was build a working model to show public how you could actually use evidence-based practice and be far more effective. The Morris Center Ocala was one of the original clinics. It opened in 2011. The Morris Center itself, as a clinical company of services, opened in 1986. Unbelievably, I joined that company in 1989. It's open for 37 years now, and I've been there for 34 of the 37 years, and I bought the company in 2008 because I decided to stop working on more research. We have millions of dollars of research showing how to early identify reading problems and intervene by age 5, and I'll show you some of that data. But if we keep doing the research and it actually doesn't get to the teachers, doesn't get to the homeschool parents, then what's the point of doing all that research? What's the point of building all these programs if it actually doesn't get to the kids? And I say that with all earnestness because I'm a dad of 2 kids with dyslexia. I'm a dad of 2 kids with dysgraphia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and sensory processing disorders. They got the full whammy. I'm dyslexic, but you won't know that I have dyslexia because I got early intervention at age 5. I happen to have a connection to a family member who was a world-famous speech pathologist who pioneered work in the medical approach to dyslexia in the 1960s, and her name is Patricia Conway Lindamood. And the Lindamoods built a big corporation, but her goal was not the corporation. Her goal was the public school sector and the parents of kids who are actually trying to get their kids more effective interventions. So we are trying to actually build better on what she started. And because of her pioneering work, that's why I got intervention at age 5. So let's just kind of talk through some of the data. And first piece is what is dyslexia? What are evidence-based programs and why does it matter? Very simply, dyslexia only has 3 criteria. It's either a deficiency in reading accuracy, or it's a deficiency in reading fluency, or it's a deficiency in reading comprehension, or 2 of the 3, or 3 of the 3. This is the diagnostic criteria that a healthcare professional who's actually licensed to diagnose dyslexia, that's the manual they use to make that determination. Do you meet criteria or not? Schools don't diagnose dyslexia. Typically, school psychologists don't diagnose dyslexia. Clinical psychologists do, neuropsychologists do, speech pathologists do, but this is the criteria that dyslexia really is defined by, except for when you talk to the public sector and you think it means people flip words around. You think it means that the kids see letters backwards, or they read words backwards. And decades ago, we thought the kids might have a visual problem because they looked at pot and said top. And they looked at, pat and said tap. And it looked like they're reading the words backwards. But then someone realized, yeah, but how come they never look at the and say et? Because if you're reading words backwards, you should be reading every word backwards, not just the ones that uniquely flip words around and become a new word. So when they really began to delve into it, we began to find out more about what dyslexia really is. And it's not a visual processing problem. It actually has symptoms from it. But dyslexia really is just used to talk about these difficulties in reading accuracy, reading speed, and reading comprehension. And there may actually also affect spelling. Commonly it affects spelling. From a neuropsychology perspective, and that's my field of training in neuropsychology, spelling is about 100 times more complicated than reading, especially in this horrible, unfair language we call English. So let's talk about reading skills. You have 3 core foundations. You've got to be able to sound out words. You've got to be able to memorize sight words because, again, English is a horrible language. You look at the word stop and we tell Johnny, sound it out, up, and he reads it like, great job, you sounded it out. Then we show him another word and he goes, yachta. We're like, no, that one's yacht. And you're like, no, I went to sound it out. Well, you can't sound out that one. As if somehow you're supposed to know that, and you're supposed to know which ones you sound out and which ones you memorize. That comes with drill and practice over time. But we know that for English, we need both of those skills equally strong. equally strong ability to sound out words, equally strong ability to memorize sight words, and a good knowledge of the vocabulary of the meaning. We did a 5-year randomized controlled trial that showed when those three are equally strong, you get one very powerful outcome, which is commonly going to be called reading fluency. We did a study comparing the commonly used approaches to train fluency. Repeated reading, choral reading, chunking, sight word preparation, sight word review, sight word flashcarding. And we compared that to another intervention that has made you really strong and really automatic at sounding out words. And we found out that the kids who got the really strong phonological processing and the really strong decoding skills became more fluent than kids who had 40 hours of fluency training. And so what we showed was, in the typical child, how does fluency build? Well, they read. And as they read more, they get better at it. And as they read more, they get faster at it. And typically, no one's actually putting typical readers in fluency practice programs. So a big part of fluency comes from those core foundational skills down below. But it asks the question, what's the purpose of reading? Why do we want kids to read? And what we find out is, well, it's not just to be able to read words. It's actually to gain some knowledge, which we more explicitly call comprehension. Now, besides being a neuropsychologist, I'm a neurorehabilitation trained specialist, which means I spent 10 years working with adults who had stroke, and the stroke caused blood supply to be lost to part of the left side of the brain, and that part of the brain dies. We have no way to bring it back. We have no way to regain or regrow new brain tissue. Once it dies, it's gone, and then we can measure and see what skills have you lost after this stroke. Believe it or not, well, let me ask the audience, how many strokes do we have a year in the US? Give me a big number. What do you think? Take a guess. How many strokes in the US? 40? Higher than that. Keep going.
500.
Keep going. Keep going. Try 800,000. Just under a million. 800,000 people a year in the US have a stroke. From those 800,000 people, we get 40,000 people who now can't read. These are functional adults. 20-year-olds, 10-year-olds can have strokes. Strokes is not just a geriatric condition. There can be other things that happen that lead to the brain having a stroke, or a brain bleed, or a brain clot. So we spent 10 years working with 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and even 80-year-olds trying to retrain reading skills post-stroke. That's 1,000 times more complicated than helping somebody who just has dyslexia or just has a genetic learning difficulty. And if you have damage up here to the front side of the left part of the brain, it will change your ability to sound out words, but not change your ability to read sight words. So you can't sound out snoise, but you can read yacht. Okay? If the damage is a little bit further back, it is the reverse. You can't read the sight words, but you can sound out words. So we know that these are differential parts of the brain with different parts of that language system. If the damage is back here, it has no impact on reading and spelling at all, but guess what? You now can't comprehend what you read, and you struggle to comprehend what people say to you. So that's how we know the comprehension is a separate system than reading skills are, and we need both systems equally strong. The talk's not about this today, but I want to tell this to you because this is a functional take-home immediately. The number one way to change comprehension skills, what do you think it is? How do you help boost your kids' comprehension or your own comprehension of spoken language or written language? Any ideas? Reading helps because you get more vocabulary. Sorry? Yeah, discussion helps. You communicate, talk about it. But ask yourself the question, but how? How does your brain comprehend? How do you remember things? And there's one researcher, his name is Dr. Alan Pavio. He's deceased now, but he spent over 6 decades trying to understand how does the brain store and retain content, knowledge. And it came to one conclusion. Those of you who are actually really good at when you're reading, you're making a movie. You see the scene, you can picture the character, you can picture, the background, you can zoom in, you can zoom out. It's a fun exploration. In fact, many of you have experienced, you read the book and you went and saw the movie and you're quite disappointed because they did not do justice to how you pictured this and what you saw, because your brain is actually more powerful at movie making if you get this training in that skill, or if you automatically just happen to build it. But we know a large percentage of kids actually don't make movies when they read. They're actually trying to remember the words they're reading over and over again. They're trying to remember what they saw on the page, and the brain can't do that. Let me say it this way. How many of you have ever seen the old sitcom Friends? Yeah, it's a funny sitcom, very comical. And if I said to you, hey, was it a good episode? You said, yeah. I said, well, can you tell me all the words everybody said in the first 5 minutes of that episode? And the answer would be, no, I can't do that. I said, well, can you tell me what happened in the first 5 minutes? Like, oh yeah, here's what happened. Ross came in and Rachel did this. I'm like, but wait. If you forgot all the words you heard them say, how do you know what happened in the story? And the answer is, I could picture it. I could retrieve the movie of what I just saw on the screen and replay that movie in my head and convert it back into words and explain it back to you. So today, in your travels, not a video player, an audiobook. If you'll put an audiobook on while you're traveling or you're en route from home to school, even for 10 minutes, and you pause the audiobook partway through and you say, hey, you know what? We're going to play a game. The story mentions a character like one of the animals. I'm going to stop and let's see if we all are picturing the animal the same way. It said that it's about a horse. And I'm thinking the horse is going to be a white body, black mane, black tail. Johnny, what do you think? Johnny's like, no, Mom. I think it's going to be a brown horse, solid brown mane, brown tail. And she said, well, Susie, what do you think? She's like, you both are wrong. It's Appaloosa. It's a beautiful Appaloosa, white with brown splotches. And then the answer is, okay, let's listen to the story, see what happens. And the story goes on, and then it says, and the horse's name was Black Beauty. And she had a beautiful, shiny black coat, and a beautiful black mane, and a beautiful black tail. And now all of you have to change your movie, because your movie was wrong. But by playing that game with your kids, you're helping them know that words can be made into movies. And you can actually describe your movie to somebody else using your words. And believe it or not, this actually applies to marital couples. One of the major sources of miscommunication between marital couples is one of the spouses has this image in their head. They start partway through that image, and the other spouse says, wait, I don't even know what we're talking about. You said neighbor, like the neighbor on the left side, the neighbor on the right side, or like the neighbor at my mom's house. What neighbor were we talking about? And you had this image in your head, and you're like partway through it, and they have no idea the image you have. So miscommunication many times means we actually didn't help each other get the movie of where we're at, and then communicate from that point forward. So today, immediately, ask your kids to picture it. Tell your kids, here's what I'm picturing of what we're going to do at the store today. Here's what I'm picturing is going to happen on our Saturday. We're going to Publix, then we're going to Grandma's house, and then we've got this barbecue in the afternoon at one of my workplaces, and you're making a movie and describing a movie to your kids. If you start doing that immediately, you will start to change your kids' comprehension skills and begin to change their verbal expression skills. We know because we have whole programs built on how to train this skill for kids, but it doesn't take a whole bunch of expertise to do this. Even just modeling it in your daily interaction and asking for it. Johnny, tell me more about what you're picturing, because I'm not thinking I've got the same movie you've got. Just asking them to describe the movie means you'll have more detailed, more verbal communication. Guess what that does for writing? If you're better at verbal expression, that is the precursor to written language. If you can't verbally tell a story with great detail, you're not ready to write it. Because writing is 100 times more complicated. Not only do you have to picture the right adjectives, verbs, adverbs, and nouns, but you got to think about punctuation and capitalization and sentence structure and order of sentences. There's so much more you have to do with writing that you don't have to do with speaking, that we want to really enhance those verbal expression skills first before we start working on the writing skills. So the more you build imagery now, then that helps them know that when they write a sentence, what should that first sentence do for the reader? Well, if your sentence says, I saw the thing by the place next to the stuff down by Grandma's. You think we got the same movie? Odds are no, but it's a grammatically correct sentence, and I'll punctuate it perfectly fine for you. But we do not have the same movie. But if I say, I saw the small white poodle walking down the brown dirt road next to that green grassy field at sunset, and it went into Grandma's backyard by the white garage. Then now we're getting the same image, and I'm using gesture along with it. So today, work on that with your kids immediately, and that's one of the things you can do as parents that's very powerful. But from the reading standpoint of things, we know that different parts of the brain do different things. And this is just a big, complicated, funny-looking brain. It's not really yellow, blue, and green, but it helps highlight things to say. The front part's controlling the motor movement of the mouth. The back part is where the auditory input and the motor control are starting to wire together. The bottom part is where that phonological processing is, your awareness of sounds and words. And I talked about this the last talk, but I'm going to say it again. What's the number one predictor of dyslexia? It's not a written letters, or it's not a reading task. It's actually a speech processing task. What you have to do is you say to the child, say cat. The child says cat. You tell them, now say cat, but don't say the k sound. 4-year-olds have been nationally tested, and we know that the majority of 4-year-olds who do not have reading problems can immediately tell you that cat without the k sound is just at. You say flame, they say flame. You say, now say flame, don't say oh. What should they say? Fame. But here's a harder one that's just fun for you guys to experience. Let's say spligrity. Everyone just say spligrity. Now say spligrity, but don't say p. Yeah, it'd be sligrity. Okay? That's not even a real word, but that measures your phonological process because you have to hold the sounds in head, split the sounds apart, figure out where the heck the p sound was, take it out, and some of you are going like, that is ridiculous, I can't do that to save my life. And guess what? You're the 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20 that can blame your parents for your weaker phonological system because it's genetic. It runs in families. Dyslexia is genetic. Dyslexia, we think, is between 5 to 20% of people across the planet. It depends on how you define it. But a new study came out of Florida State in 2021 that said, if you define dyslexia by measuring someone's reading comprehension to their listening comprehension, and you find out their listening comprehension is at the 80th percentile, it's really strong, and their reading comprehension is at the 30th percentile, it's still, quote, on grade level, but that's a big gap, then they probably have a reading deficit, and then it's actually 1 out of 3 people. It's 33% of your students, 33% of the class are going to have difficulties between their listening comprehension and their reading comprehension, which means a large percentage of people in the US don't read well. So that's part of the anatomy parts of it, just to think about how the brain's working, but the brain's really not that localized. This is a whole bunch of fMRI studies combined onto one brain. To illustrate one point, there's not one part that's the motor control part. There's not one part that's the phonological processor. There really is not one part that is a semantic piece. All the green dots were when you were making judgments about sentences and sentence structure. All of the red dots is when they were asking you to make judgments about the meaning of words and the meaning of sentences. And all the blue dots were making judgments about the phonology of words, like what's the first sound, what's the last sound, cat without the k sound. And what you see there is a mixed blue, green, red network across this left side of the brain from the frontal lobes down to the temporal lobes and back up to the occipital lobes. That is our language network. There's a whole slew of wiring that has to happen there to build these language processing skills. So it's not so simple as there's one area for this, one area for that. It's much more distributed. But we do have developmental models. So we do know that the first thing a kid's going to build is phonology. What's the first thing you learn in your language when you're a child? You learn how to read it, speak it, or spell it. Yeah, you speak it, which means phonology. You're hearing someone speak to you. Hopefully, when do parents start speaking to kids? Yeah, in utero, or at least by the time they're born. Please talk to them, because that's going to fuel their phonological processing, because you're actually speaking to kids. Next, we know kids begin to learn the meanings of words after they hear you saying words. And that's typically happening by about 9 months of age. Another take-home for parents, especially young parents. At what age can you do American Sign Language with kids, and why would you do it? 6 to 8 months. By 6 to 8 months, you can start saying, you want some milk? Are you thirsty? You want some milk? You want to eat? You want to eat a cookie? You need a cookie? You want some more? And you can just be signing while you're doing it. And let me be very clear, I'm saying you sign while you speak. Because when I started doing this with my children, my mother, who's very supportive, and she's almost 90 now, and she was a special ed teacher for most of her latter career. She's very supportive, and when she heard we were doing sign language with our children, she said, I love that you're doing sign language, that sounds fabulous, but answer one question. Why aren't you speaking to the children? Like, no, you do sign language and talk to them. It's both. So you pair the sign and gesture together, and guess what happens to your child as soon as you start that? Within a few months, they can have up to 50 signs. They can be 10, 11 months old, and they can sign 50 different signs back to you. How many words do 10-month-olds usually speak? Yeah, few to none. Most kids, expressive speaking starts at 12 months of age. But that's because the motor control system of speech develops later than the actual perception system of speech, and then the actual comprehension system. Those develop before the speaking skills actually come on board. So you can have conversations with your 10-month-old, 14-month-old, 60-month-old, and they're not speaking that well, but you actually decrease the terrible twos and the frustration because they can communicate with you. So you bring in that sign language right away because the semantic system is already coming on board at least by 9 months of age. And then you get into the structure of words, it's just the syntax. And now we get to the written language of reading, spelling, writing. Oh, and this top one, it's actually a foreign language. That's mathematics. Math is a foreign language. It has a vocabulary that only applies to math. And some of you say, yeah, math is just foreign altogether. I'm not good at math. Math is just an alien concept. But really, math is a foreign language. Denominator, numerator, I made a nonsense word, subtraction, addition, division, they mean nothing except for in the context of the concept of math. So when you don't have strong phonological processing, strong auditory memory, strong language skills, you're missing some of the foundation skills you need for math, which is why we put math at the top of the developmental chart. Math skills will build better when children have all these lower level skills built. Notice too on the left side, in that dark blue, and in the right side in the light blue, we have two other speaking skills developing. One is called receptive language, the other is called expressive language. That means the receptive language is down lower because the child starts comprehending what you're saying earlier than they can actually speak back to you. Expressive language is they're speaking and they're conversing with you by speech. But it all comes back to that core foundational block, which is we know that phonological awareness is that really, really, really key building block for not only language skills, but also for reasoning, problem solving, and metalinguistics is using language to reason and problem solve, also known as executive function. So these executive function training programs aren't going to do much for your kid if they don't have stronger phonological processing. Because executive function means you're organizing, planning information, but if you can't hold on to the information, there's nothing to organize or plan with. So all the intervention programs that we've worked on have shown that the best outcomes are we train that phonological processing first. And this is a big model that I'm not going to go into, but just to show you how much researchers try to break this all down. I'm going to highlight the bottom row because the bottom row is the most important part. These are the 4 sensory systems that build phonological awareness. So the foolishness that someone sent you a bunch of programs that says, we're going to do find the first sound in auditory activities, find the last sound in auditory activities. We're going to do perceive sounds, and we're doing all these auditory drill. Okay? That would mean that when you taught a child to speak or when you taught a child to listen, you would do it by covering your mouth. Nobody does that. Nobody covers their mouth when they're talking to a child. Phonological awareness is not an acoustic-only phenomenon. We know it's actually part acoustic, but we know from laser eye tracking studies that infants start watching your mouth by 8 months of age. So it's part visual. They're watching your lips move, watching your mouth move, and they get into babbling very shortly thereafter. And so it's part acoustic, part visual, and part motor control of the teeth, tongue, and lips. This is what we call classic speech-language pathology. Speech pathologists are the experts in how does a language system develop. And let me tell you how complicated it is. There's a researcher in the University of Washington. She has spent over 5 decades studying the development of the speech perception input system and the speech production system. She has this great name. She gets to tell people that she is Dr. Cool because her last name is spelled K-U-H-L and is pronounced cool. So Dr. Cool has studied the speech system, but only in one restricted age range. For 50 years, guess what the age range is that she has studied? 0 birth to 12 months. She spent 50 years just studying the development of language in the first year of life. That's how complicated the system is. But we begin to tease it apart and understand more about it and know that it's 4 sensory systems wiring together. So just doing auditory training activities with your kids, you might as well be speaking to your kids with masks on and never let them see your mouth. You're not giving the brain all the sensory inputs it needs to fully build that system. From phonology, we know then we go into models of reading. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of this, but just to say there's part visual, which is orthographic. That's the letter structures. There's part articulatory. That's motor control. Some kids actually have motor dyspraxia, which means they struggle to get their mouth to move the way it should move. And they struggle to get their tongue up, and they struggle to get their tongue out. And you say, do this, go, oh, and they go, and you're like, no, don't do that, just do this. Oh, well, they would if they could. But they're really struggling to control their tongue, and it's a motor level of deficiency that can be interfering with speech processing and articulation. There's the phonological system, and there's prosody. That's that fluidness of your speech and your tone. And there's morphosyntactic. That's understanding that small parts of words have meaning. Un means something on a word as a prefix. Con means something as well. Yes?
What is prosody?
Prosody is like the intonation you use when you talk. So the East Indians, they talk like this and the voice goes up and down. And they have a different prosody than we have. The Asians have a different prosody. The people from Boston have a different prosody than people from South Florida. It's more like the tone and the flow of speech, the flow of speech in spoken language. That's that If you get a right hemisphere damage, you lose the ability to judge your tone. I can't tell if you're angry or sad by your tone, and I can't tell it from your facial expressions either. And how they do that is they'll say to someone who's had a right hemisphere brain injury, they'll say, we're going to say some sentences. Tell us if there's anything unusual about these sentences. And the examiner with great expression will go, all the puppies are dead. And they're like, is there anything wrong with that? And they're like, well, no, but it's not a very happy sentence. And they don't notice that you shouldn't be smiling with great glee on your face saying something morbid like that, because they actually don't register that, and they don't register that you said it with a joy in your tone. So they miss all that information, and they become very flat. Some of you will say, well, yeah, I have a spouse like that. He's flat all the time, but he hasn't had a brain injury, and he speaks very monotone, and he's just dry, but that's just how George is. And yes, some of this can be developmental as well without brain injury. Our brains have amazing growth and learning potential over time. But that phonological piece is a key piece. We know from brain imaging studies that you see different activity patterns in the brain when you have typical reading skills versus when you don't have strong reading skills. So the top brain, the left side is doing more of the work, and the child is a strong reader. The bottom one, the right side, is doing more of the work, and the child is not a very strong reader. So someone asked in my last talk about, what about that right hemisphere reading program? Well, I don't know of any research studies that says you should be trying to train the right hemisphere for better reading. Because typical strong readers, the left side is doing most of the work, the right is doing other functions. When you have a brain injury on the right, not only might you lose prosody, but you also might lose math skills, more so than a brain injury on the left. So know that those patterns show up, and then we know why those patterns are different, because this is a postmortem study, after-death study with I think it's about a dozen people. It's a mixture of kids and adults in Harvard. Harvard did this study, and they did a very electron microscope tissue sample of the brains of people who had died who had dyslexia. And the question was, is there anything structurally different about it? And the answer was yes. And anywhere there's a black dot, there was something different about the brain. There was something different about how the brain cells were organized. I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of like scattered all over, right? Well, no, not really, because when you see how it lays out, you see that there's certain parts of the brain, I thought there was another slide. There's certain parts of the brain, those circles are major language parts of the brain. There's the speech perception part in the middle, there's the sound to motor control part, and there's the visual part down at the bottom. So these are major speech parts of the brain. What we think is happening is before the child is born, there's about 6 different genes that influence how the brain aligns in this language part of the brain. This is why we understand that dyslexia is genetic. If one of you as a parent has any history of reading problems, not even you, it could be your brother, your child's 50% more likely to have reading problems too. If both parents have any history, it's like 80% more likely that you're going to have a child who has reading problems. But sometimes you have 2 parents who have no history whatsoever, and they have a child with reading problems, because that's how genetics works. Sometimes it makes a new mix that has never happened before. But we know that we think is happening. This shows a slice of brain tissue going from level 1, which is at the outer side, from level 1 down the inside up to layer 6 on the outside, and it shows these brain wiring actually migrates from the back of the brain out to the outer cortex before the baby's even born. Typical brain, 100 billion brain cells. And they're doing this migration before the child is even born. If a few don't make the journey properly, it should be okay, right? You should have a few extra. 100 billion's a lot. Yes, but from that slide we showed, yeah, but it happened in a lot in just key areas. It wasn't randomly scattered across the whole brain. There's a whole bunch of black dots right here in the phonological processor, a whole bunch of black dots right here in the motor control system, which gives you an increased predisposition that this is going to interfere with your brain's learning, because those neurons did not migrate quite as properly as they should have, and the brain's less efficiently wired. Now, if our brains were hardwired, as some dyslexia groups are mistakenly saying, there's a group called Made by Dyslexia, and they're saying, no, we have these 5 skills that typical readers don't have. We have these other strengths, and our brains are hardwired differently. We are the brains of the next century, learners, thinkers, and they're trying to convince businesses that all dyslexics have skills that typical readers don't have. It's completely not true, because nobody's brain is hardwired. The brain is malleable. It changes, because what learning is new wiring. So if we said the brain was hardwired, we basically would say you can't learn anything, because you can't make any new connections. But everybody's brain has the capacity to make new connections and to learn new information. That's what that neuroplasticity is. How did they see it? This is one of the electron microscopic study slices. Layer 1 is that top layer, layer 2 is the bottom layer. And you see there's more black dots in the bottom layer, except for in that circle. There's somehow a bunch of black dots clustered right there in that circle. And it's like when the brain wiring was growing, it was supposed to stop at layer 2, but it went on up into layer 1. Ectopia means eruption, like a volcanic eruption. It erupted up into the next level. So it's going to create some noise in that level. It's going to make it less likely to be processing speech sounds as efficiently. Here's the bigger model of that we have. We're saying the the genetics lead to the left side having some of those inefficient wiring, which means you're probably going to struggle to learn your phonological awareness, which means you're going to struggle to learn letters and sounds and keep the letter sounds combinations, which means you're more likely to struggle to read. So this is our biology to cognition to the behavior that we call reading. Full set of data to show that we know dyslexia is genetic. Now, does that mean that all kids with reading problems have dyslexia? No. Because our public school system and even our private school system are so poor in teaching reading that our national data, if you go to nationsreportcard.gov, our national data shows that only 35% of kids in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade learn to read, and it's been that level for 40 years. So for 40 years, we only achieve grade level literacy skills for 35% of kids across all grade levels. That's not dyslexia. That's poor methodologies that have been able to be given to kids that actually haven't been proven to be effective. That's the opposite of evidence-based. That means some publisher made up a program, convinced the school to buy it, they bought it, and they'll use it for a couple of years until they see their reading scores don't get better, and then what do? They throw it out and buy another one. And what do they do next? They throw it out and buy another one. What happens next? They throw it out and buy another one. And they keep recycling the same program, the same methodologies with a new name, a new label, and maybe a new PhD's name on it. But it's essentially the same approach to what's happening with literacy instruction that's not very effective. So we published a study in '91 to show that we know that it's possible to actually make more progress in skills because we took a dozen kids and we published how we took these 12 kids and made large gains in literacy skills, about 3 to 5 grade levels in about 9 to 10 weeks. So we did intensive instruction, 4 to 6 hours a day, 5 days a week of one-on-one instruction to see, does high intensity, high frequency instruction really change the skills? Because if you can't do it in high intensity, high frequency, then there's no point in using that method in a classroom, which is not high intensity and is not high frequency. From this study, then we published another set of 5-year study. This was taking kids who are 8 to 10 years old, who are already in special ed. They all have IEPs and they all have diagnosis of dyslexia. And they're not progressing. What's the success rate of special ed? 5% of kids make enough improvement to leave special ed. 95% of children will stay in special ed for the rest of their life, which means what special ed is doing sounds logical. Let's give Johnny what Johnny needs and give Sally what she needs and give Jimmy what he needs. But what we're giving them has not actually been proven to be effective, so we're basically just kind of guessing and randomly trying different things. And it's not very effective. So much so that here's the data from Gainesville, Florida, which is Alachua County Public Schools. And this is 30 kids, and this is how much growth they made in 16 months of special ed. They came in scoring about the 10th percentile, and 16 months later, where are they? They're still at the 10th percentile. Then we took those kids and put them into this evidence-based program that goes back to the speech processing first, building phonology, then building decoding skills, then you get to sight words, then you get to book reading. It has a whole developmental hierarchy, and here's the growth we made in 8 weeks. They've made several grade levels of gain in 8 weeks' time. This is what we call a dosage study. We then stopped the instruction, not because they were done, but because every kid could only get 80 hours of instruction, and then we had to stop. The question we were asking was, how much progress do kids make if they only get 80 hours of instruction? Why do we stop at 80 hours? Because we only had $1 million, and that's all it could afford us to provide. You'd think $1 million would go a lot farther, but when you got 30 kids in this group and 30 kids in this group, doing testing before and testing after, and testing 1 year after, testing 2 years after, the money goes very quickly. But the real question here was, but what happens when you stop the instruction? The answer was, their skills got even stronger 1 year after instruction had ended. And the answer was, and 2 years later, they're still getting stronger. Because like a typically developing child, when you've given them all the phonological processing skills they need, they've got really strong comprehension skills, the more they use them, what happens? The stronger they become. That's what happens for kids who don't have dyslexia, don't have reading skills. This was their change in their ability to sound out words. The prior graph was their reading comprehension. They came in decoding words at the 5th percentile, and 8 weeks later, with 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, up to 80 hours of instruction, we had them decoding at the 45th percentile. And then 1 year later, the skills start to dip down, but they still stay at grade level. 2 years later, now they're starting to curve back up, which tells us that probably 80 hours isn't enough to really solidify those decoding skills, but it didn't let it drop back to where they were before treatment. So it was enough to build a functional change, but it just is going to slowly take more progress to get it to continue to grow at the same rate. So then we published another 5-year study. It's another $1 million project. This was conducted in Tallahassee. We screened 1,500 5-year-olds. We pulled out 160 kids who were in the bottom 12% on phonological awareness. We then gave 40 of them nothing, because legally and ethically we're allowed to do that, because nobody knew if you actually change these skills for these kids. And we followed them for 2 years. We found out that a large percentage don't pass kindergarten or first grade, and it looks like this. If you do nothing, 41% don't pass kindergarten or first grade. If you take 40 kids who are equally at risk and equally strong IQs and strong vocabularies and give them an extra one-on-one time with whatever the teacher's doing, because maybe the method doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that you're personally instructing them and giving them some personal time. It actually doesn't matter. 30% still don't pass kindergarten or first grade, and there's no difference between the RCS and the NT group. Whether you do nothing or do a little extra one-on-one, statistically it's not going to be a big difference in the outcomes. The third group was explicit phonics, systematic, structured, synthetic phonics. And what we found was, if it's not good enough just to give them one-on-one time, maybe the program matters to what you're doing, so we should all get the same phonics program. And the answer was no, it didn't matter. 25% still don't pass kindergarten and first grade if your instruction goes to phonics, because phonics goes straight to the letters. But remember, the predictor of dyslexia is not anything to do with letters. The predictor of dyslexia is the phonological processing skills. So then the last group, we started all the instruction training at the phonological processing group using that now Foundations for Speech, Language, Reading, and Spelling program, which is basically a much more advanced version of what the Lindamoods built in 1969. They wrote a program in 1969 called Auditory Discrimination in Depth. We took that program and began modifying it, changing it, and built it into a stronger program. And when they got that speech processing program first, and then it went to decoding second, and then it went to sight word skills third, and then it went to paragraph reading later, you followed a developmental hierarchy, we got 91% of those kids to be passing kindergarten and first grade. And again, what's the outcome down the road? The outcome is, in second grade, they're reading accuracy and they're reading speed. Both are equally strong. 2 years later in fourth grade, they're still equally strong, and they're not struggling in reading accuracy or reading speed. So it was one of the first studies ever to show you can prevent reading problems. We thought we had given education the golden ticket. This should be easy to let someone go do teacher training and push it out there. And we found out that schools are not required to buy programs that are published and peer-reviewed and shown to be highly effective. They can buy whatever they want. And the teacher's at the mercy of what a person is called the chief academic officer. In a school district, the chief academic officer picks the literacy program. Not the teachers, not some scientific committee. One person picks the literacy program for the district, and that's what all the teachers get. So we struggle to actually get teachers to actually be able to get access to these programs because the schools aren't required to buy it, and they might like something else different. This just shows pre-post that the kid at the top here, this left side of the brain had very little activity before treatment, and they have much stronger activity after treatment, which mimics what you saw in the data for their functional skills. We see new brain activity patterns before and after that matches the strengths in reading skills. This tells you in an fMRI format that learning is rewiring the brain. Learning is new activity, new wiring getting stronger. It's how you built your bike riding skills. It's how you built your piano playing skills. It's how you built your art skills. It takes practice to build these skills, and when you build the skills to high automaticity, the brain has new and stronger wiring to support it. We have a new technology called diffusion tensor imaging. That other image showed the outside of the brain. This actually literally shows the wiring inside the brain, and they have new studies that they can show how that wiring pattern or that big cord of wiring gets stronger and thicker between specific areas as you change phonological processing. So this is called diffusion tensor imaging, which shows us how the wiring is changing in terms of the others. How do we do that? Anything you learn is based on these 6 elements. It doesn't matter what topic we're talking about. Literacy, yes. Bike riding, yes. Macrame, yes. Violin playing, yes. All 6 of these apply. How intense is the instruction, which means how many hours per day do you practice? My mother's 90. She still practices the piano 3 hours a day. She's never stopped practicing the piano 3 hours a day. She loves to keep doing high intensity, high practice with her piano playing. Frequency, how many days per week? We know that all instruction is going to be better if you get 5 days a week instruction. I asked the last group this, and I'll ask you guys too, and most of the parents who were involved in toilet training will laugh at this. Did you consider toilet training just on Tuesdays and Thursdays? Would that be enough? And that's ridiculous. Yeah, if you want to do it for a couple months or more, yeah, just try that. But if you really want toilet training to kick in and build really quickly, you do toilet training every day, and sometimes even all day long every day, until the kids got it, and once they've got it, you're done. The wiring is automatic enough. So it's high intensity, high frequency, explicit instructions. The training follows a developmental hierarchy. Basic skills, then mid-level skills, then advanced skills, and you have to do it long enough until the skills become automatic. Once the skills are automatic, then we're actually good to go, and the skills are done. So the talk's titled, How to Mix Oil and Water. Why oil and water? Because I've just been giving you all the oil, which is all the science. But schools aren't required to follow the science. You're not getting information based on science, even as homeschooling parents. You're getting things that is the water, which is things people are making up. It's not required to be tested. It's not required to be proven effective. Physicians cannot give your child a medication unless it's been tested and proven to be effective. If they give you a made-up concoction of chemicals instead of giving you penicillin for strep throat, that's called medical malpractice. They'll be sued. They will lose their license. But we don't have that same caliber of review and assurance that what we're doing in education is going to be giving us the best outcomes. So does every child learn differently? Every child has different strengths and weaknesses. And they're going to use their strengths more to learn from than their weaknesses, but anatomically, the brain has the same 8 core systems that build all your strengths and weaknesses. It's the 5 senses you learned in school: see, hear, touch, taste, smell. But there's 3 more that are the core of all learning for the brain. It's vestibular, which is balance awareness. It's proprioception, which is body awareness in space. And it's interoception. It's your internal awareness of hunger, toileting, mood, all these other internal systems. When those 8 systems are working well, you will build strong language skills. You will build strong sensory motor skills. If there's any deficiencies in those 8 skills, it will lead to less efficiencies, which means weaknesses, as opposed to more efficient skills, which means strengths. So yes, kids can have a variable pattern of strengths and weaknesses, but they're actually not wired to learn differently. We just need to figure out how to take the weaker skills and make them stronger. That's what we did in our studies. We found these kids with really low phonological awareness. We didn't try to work around it and just do sight words. We tackled the weaker skills and made them stronger, and the children soared and they left special ed.
When you say tackle the weaker skills, for our kiddos that we see that have the reading deficit, but they also have 0 down, so they have no idea where their body is.
Yes.
So do you tackle those vestibular and proprioceptive things first to start to build on the...
If it's severe enough, which usually is the autism spectrum kids. Many autism kids I can't do any language therapy with yet, and I have to do OT with first. I've got to build engagement, I've got to build regulation, modulation, attention focus. All of those precede learning. And then we can get to language skills, especially if they're a nonverbal child with autism. They've got even more severe impairments in these lower level sensory motor skills. If it's a typical child who just has a dyslexia, we can actually build both simultaneously. They can be doing OT and then work on the language system for an hour, and then back to OT for an hour, then back to the language for an hour. And we can tag team back and forth, and that's what our medical clinics do. The Morris Center is a medical clinic that does up to 6 hours a day of the one-on-one instruction over time. Other points to consider. We're running short on time, so I'm going to wrap it up towards the end. But the end point is, for schools and for you guys to truly reach your child's potential, we've got to mix the science with the water. You've got to mix the oil and water together. The two have to be coming together. Science has tons of data that's not getting into education, is not getting to you as homeschool parents. If we incorporate the science into educational practices, then we know that 10 to 20% of kids who have reading problems are less likely to have poor reading skills, are less likely to end up in juvenile justice, less likely to be high school dropouts, less likely to be involved in suicide, prison, domestic violence. There's a whole huge host of benefits of early tackling literacy skills. And if we don't do it, then our kids aren't going to get the same outcomes. And if you want to talk to somebody who did it himself, we've got a young man here who agreed to come sit in the front, and this is Asher. Asher's from Dallas, Texas. Asher was reading to the 10th percentile when he was 15 years old. Today, Asher's on a full ride academic scholarship for year 1 to Tarleton State University in Texas. Why? Because at age 15, he heard me talking with his father, who also had dyslexia, and he heard the science. He's like, Dad, I think I want to do that, because that sounds like that might actually help me. And Asher took the time. He did about 80 hours of instruction online. 7 a.m., 2 hours a day, of his own accord, worked his tail off, and in about 80 hours rebuilt all his reading and spelling skills. And then he did our comprehension program, and he did the math program. And those are all the deficits he had, and he's been an exceptional student since then, and the GPA is 4.6 GPA. And that's from somebody who is dyslexic and was reading at the 10th percentile. But then it's not just with the young guys, then ask him about the old guy, his dad. Because then we took his 45-year-old dad, who didn't believe we could actually change his wiring, and his father, Stephen, is sitting over here as well. And Stephen runs a podcast called Empower Dyslexia, and we rebuilt his skills at age 45. And Stephen did it in a short amount of time as well. And even at age 45, you can still rebuild the phonological processors. How do we know that? Because we did it with 80-year-olds who had brain damage and 70-year-olds who had brain damage. That's 1,000 times more difficult than helping Asher and Stephen work at their full potential. We're at booth 914. If you want to talk to more of my team, we're there explaining more, talking more about the methods. I didn't talk about the methods because it's hard enough to get through the science. But I appreciate your time. Happy to step outside and answer questions. Thank you so much.